Okay, I'd like to open up the floor to questions or comments that folks may have. And I'll start it off. So, this morning we spent a lot of time talking about linking foreign aid to human trafficking, about how jobs can perhaps make a difference, both in terms of reducing the attractions, if you will, for young folks and becoming involved in violent extremism, and also to try to head off human trafficking. But after listening to Nilofer, I'm starting to scratch my head a little bit, and I'm wondering, is there a type of underlying assumption oftentimes, perhaps in certain communities, in the public at large, among policymakers, that, this can be solved with economic development. And if we just manage that people, again, overall GDP rises in parts of the world and people are more prosperous, that's the way we ought to go. That's something that we can do. And that's something, again, very palpable for the government actors to do as well. And I know for, of course, but if others want to chime in.
Yeah, so I think that one of the problems, so I think that academics and policymakers don't speak enough to each other, so I'm really glad that this is happening. In general, I think academics are really good at isolating the problems without giving the solutions, and I think that violent extremism and the study of violent extremism is one of those areas, and I think that you're correct that every new study that comes out, I find we have a better sense of what isn't working as well as we want, but we aren't really providing alternatives. And I think that this question that you raised about what do you do when 3 years into a project and you realize the indicators are starting to dip, do you stop? Like, what do you do? I think just as a caveat to my presentation, we are trying to measure outcomes, which are also difficult to measure. Yeah. And so the Afghanistan study that I cited, perhaps the problem wasn't with the cash grants, perhaps it's with measuring support for the government. Perhaps that's not a good outcome measure, or perhaps we're just asking the wrong questions to get at it. So I think that even though we should have a healthy skepticism of all the various interventions and tools we're using, we should also not be so quick to take them off the table only if one study shows that it's not working. So that's just to say I don't really have any answers, except that maybe we do have the answers. We just have to have a better way of figuring out how to measure them as well.
I also think that unit of analysis matters. So I think a policy might not be having a measurable impact at the individual level, but it might be having an impact at the group level. Okay. And so that this is why you need the multi-method analysis, because if people are not telling you, individuals are not telling you that it's having an impact, but if a population is having less, then even if you're not getting the sentiment change, if you're getting the behavioral change at the group level or the organizational level, then you're seeing key differences. Right? And it's taken about 30 years, but there's now been a very clear understanding that discrimination makes violence go up, and lowering discrimination makes violence go down, and sometimes that does not jive with individual level interviews, right? So you're getting different viewpoints from the different levels of analysis, and I think in a lot of these studies, in terms of the impact of these events, you don't have to do anything. It would be useful to try and look at this at different levels because what you're going to see may be different, and the policy implications of these different levels can be very important.
Gina?
This was a very enjoyable presentation to listen to.
Good.
Because it's always interesting to explore what else can we do and how can we be doing it. And just one more thing about trying to measure results is that sometimes the problem is not that the intervention is not working, but the problem is that whoever was implementing the intervention didn't do it well. And so it's very difficult sometimes to sort of separate whether the intervention was applied properly or whether the intervention just applied, the type of intervention was applied was the wrong intervention. And I see it every day on the field, on the ground. And the other thing I wanted to say is that one reason that we wanted to do this is because we have found in our work over the past few decades that you can have long-lasting results by sort of pairing academics and researchers here with ones in developing countries. And this is a way that we often have sought sustainability, is to actually help build the capacity, the research capacity on the local level around political and social issues, so that people locally actually have the tools and are empowered to sort of look into their own issues and to advance them with the government.
So, first of all, thank you for introducing the music. That's great. Second, I think those are both very useful comments. I think that one of the issues when we think about assessment, and I'm not an expert in what USAID does, but I've seen assessments of a lot of efforts by different countries. And a lot of times what is missing is a comparison with a group that has not been treated. Okay? There is often no control group assessment. So I did it here, and I want to assess, has it had an impact here? But I'm not comparing it to an area where it wasn't done. And I think that that's a huge methodological flaw, because it's very possible that if you do across those, it may be getting worse in the area where you're applying your treatment, but it may be getting much worse in the area where you're not applying treatment, because if you don't do that you don't do the control group, you're not able really to account for those external factors that may be making things worse across the board, and you need to get at that other area. And this is one of the reasons why there's real value in these cross-national examinations or cross-regional examinations in terms of understanding this. But I think also you're raising the point of maybe they're just not doing a good job. And that's something that has to be assessed as well, but I think in a different fashion.
I'm also just wanting to add to the comment you said about economic development being a key contributor possibly. I'm thinking also the need to compare variables, as the South says, not just the locations or the areas, but the variables. For example, economic development versus ideology. I mean, I think we are a country that would be considered developed, but we're also suffering of a lot of that violence extremism. And even though we may think it comes from other countries or because of terrorist activities, we have our own growth of violence extremism. Canada just had that event yesterday. So it's hard to say that it's just because we be economically developed, we'd solve the issue of human trafficking or violence extremism. I think there's other variables that we need to compare, even keeping the economy constant, for example. So yeah, I don't know, I'm just reacting as probably the policy.
So one of the thought, and I think it actually harmonizes with some of the work that Matt is doing. One of the other things to think about is not focusing simply on those that perpetrate these kinds of acts, but what are the broader environmental factors that are helping to enable those things to occur. So, one of the studies that's always really stuck with me that we did is much smaller, wasn't using the Big Allied and Dangerous data set, was actually looking at terrorism perpetrated by Israelis in Israel. And it really looked at a terror cell that was embedded in a broader social movement within Israeli society. And the fact that that cell existed and was able to persist for a while was that there were large numbers of other people who were sympathetic to the ideals and the aims of the group. They didn't want to themselves be violent, but they also weren't going to turn those people in for the things that they were doing. And so I think having this broader focus that looks at the environment in which the perpetrators are actually embedded is important to understanding how some of these organizations or behaviors are reproduced, because there's a set of individuals that are interested and could be turned into adherents over time, or they provide the social buffer between those that are trying to stop these kinds of behaviors and those that are actually perpetrating. So I think thinking about those factors are also very important. And it gets to the sorts of things that Matt was talking about, where you have a core, but there's more that's going on around that core, which is important.
Okay, I've got a question here, Toby.
Hi. A lot of what we've been talking about today is in terms of, the past 10, 15 years or so. But we all know that things like this have been going on for millennia, especially trafficking in persons. We've seen that throughout history over and over again. We've seen violence over and over again. Have there been any more longitudinal studies? Is there anything we can go back to from, even 60 or 70 years ago to see how some of this has changed? And maybe draw upon those learnings to see how it might be changing in the future or what might have been causing the situation we have now?
No. So there are phenomena that are extremely important that people write about or express opinions about that have serious paucity of data to analyze across time and across areas. And what you're highlighting is the need to think about how we can do a better job in this particular area to be able to get at what you're talking about. I mean, it's crucial. And there have been qualitative stuff, there have been some case study quantitative stuff, but there needs to be a lot more work than has currently been done.
I would like to comment in the context of trafficking in persons. So we know slavery today, trafficking today, modern slavery, is not the exact same as slavery in the US a couple hundred years ago, right? So the question is, what kind of progress have we made since then? So obviously the emancipation is a big step forward. But also our definition of slavery and trafficking have changed over time. And so the question is, how do you compare data across history? And at what point, do you say that, well, the job is done? So it makes it difficult, right? Because you don't have a common set of indicators over history.
I was just going to make 2 comments on that. Much of my work is interested in the persistence of relationships across geographic distance. I guess I would analogize to Carl and Victor's work that one of their main interests is how relationships of interest persist across social distance. I mean, thinking about the relational component of network analysis being the equivalent of the physical component of spatial analysis. And I think you're pointing out that there's something important maybe about temporal distance. Right? That things might persist or decay over time as well, and it's important to pay attention to that dimension. The other thing that I was going to say is just an example of something, a concrete example that helped me reframe the way I think about Mexico. I'm originally from Mexico, and I also study violence in Mexico and Central America. And lots of people have been paying attention to the spike in violence in Mexico over the last 10 years. Right? But then if you look backwards, and everybody sort of frames it in the context of this historical crisis and violence. Right? But if you go back another 10, 20 years, then it pales in comparison to what some of the political violence that was taking place during the authoritarian period in Mexico. And then we come into some measurement issues, right? Are we measuring the same thing? Was the data being manipulated? So now we get into some of the points that Victor was raising, right? There's some data quality issues. But I think that temporal perspective is also crucial.
You have enough? Yep.
Sorry. I just wanted to note, and this is just my opinion as a person who implements programs on the ground, is I'm very interested to understand, to see what research shows as far as what interventions work and what doesn't work, and why are certain things the way they are. And for that, you need to, as you mentioned, as you said earlier, to sort of isolate the intervention or the factors or the populations and so forth, and sort of look at things with a laser sharp focus from a research perspective. But from an implementation perspective, you then have to sort of take those learnings and turn them into a holistic program that cannot just look at one factor or one population, but actually look at the different stakeholders and how they all interact, and then look at different interventions. So for example, you can't, on the one hand, probably economic development does work to lower violent extremism, but that alone is not enough. You also have to have equitable and diversified growth. You have to have representation by civil society organizations. So my point is that you almost have to do two things at the same time that at first glance may seem opposed to each other. One is to have sort of a laser sharp focus and sort of try to look at each intervention separately, but on the other hand, when you come to implementation, you actually have to combine them all. Not all, but you have to combine many of them together. You cannot just look at a silver bullet.
Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted, on my way over, I was talking to a colleague from Africa, and he was saying to me, well, it's interesting that you're going to that event. I mean, given that women don't have constitutional equality in the United States, how are you going to project support to communities in other places? And I thought that was kind of interesting coming from him. And just wanted to throw that out there, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the argument that around the world that is respected, but not in the United States. These are problems that are still, I think, impacting all kinds of approaches to research. I mean, it's really difficult to be in the field and have to stand, pretending that I have these rights when I don't, and yet I'm supposed to be helping. I mean, I think these are still really important and critical issues, and I don't know, I guess I'm saying we should think about it and we need to fight for the ERA, first of all, personally. We're 2 states away, and we really need to get the constitutional equality for women as a start and project that around the world, and I think that would be a big help. And I do think that people are looking to us right now for how are we handling our own situation of violence in this country, And so I think I'm wondering about this approach of going out and helping again that I hear here that I'm a little concerned about, because we have to also talk about what we're doing here for our own extremism. Thank you.
As an LGBT specialist and USAID, I frequently engage with communities who suffer from the lack of rights. And I think my view isn't that I'm more capable and I'm helping them, but that we're helping each other, that we collaborate to help move the movement forward for rights for all globally. And while we may have some lessons that we can share with them, they also have lessons they can share with us, particularly from the grassroots level, which I think is very helpful.
Is anyone else? Okay. Well, our time has come to an end for this panel, and I would like to thank our panelists. And as I understand it,